So in our previous parts, we highlighted a number of things wrong with Dany's backstory in Daenerys 1: A Game of Thrones, including the timing of Viserys' escape from King's Landing being contradicted by Jaime's account, Dany's conception being incredibly unlikely given the known state of her mother's fertility, the massive and legendary storm being in the wrong season and not being mentioned by anyone else, the purported damage to Dragonstone going against its fused stone nature and being completely unreported by Davos and Crescent, the supposed destroyed fleet and surrendering garrison going against the reports of Stannis and Davos of a battle at Dragonstone, the contradiction of all the ships being destroyed yet Viserys and Dany escaping on a ship, and the disappearing characters from our story, namely the 4 loyal men. Not to mention, there's all of the contradictions regarding Sir Willem Darry, him being a great bear of a man despite wasting away, him never leaving his bed yet Dany remembering him walking, him being a man-at-arms yet somehow old and grey despite Aerys surrounding himself with men his own age, him being a man-at-arms yet Viserys being untrained with the sword, him being a man-at-arms and yet having soft hands instead of calloused ones, and him smelling hot and moist despite Braavos being cold and rainy. There's a lot of problems, and we haven't even gotten to the lemon tree. But let's set that all aside right now and talk about Blood of the Dragon, the so-called first draft of the Daenerys story in A Game of Thrones. This version of the Daenerys story is pretty darn rare and hard to come by. Only an absolutely insane person would own a copy. Don't worry, I scanned it and it's linked below. So Blood of the Dragon was published in the July 1996 issue of Asimov's science fiction, though the July issue is a bit of a misnomer as it came out at the end of May. Whatever the case, the story was released 2 months before A Game of Thrones was published on August 1st, 1996. Now, regarding this, it's important to talk a little bit about how the publishing process works and where our author was in his writing when A Game of Thrones and Blood of the Dragon came out. So, prior to publishing a book, an author submits a manuscript to the publisher who then reviews and edits it, copy editing and proofing and such. It goes back and forth between the editor and author until the product is satisfactory, and this process can take several months. Then the book actually needs to be printed and distributed, which takes a while. For example, with A Dance with Dragons, George R.R. Martin announced being finished on April 27, 2011, but it was not published until July 12th. And that's a publisher working as fast as they humanly could during peak popularity of the material. We aren't exactly sure when our author finished his manuscript for A Game of Thrones, but with an August 1st release, it was certainly prior to April of 1996, and probably a few months before that. Another important thing to remember is that when our author finished his manuscript for A Game of Thrones, he was way over his publisher's target page count, and thus 300 manuscript pages were cut and pushed into A Clash of Kings, roughly 1/4 of that book. And so it's of note that during the manuscript review process for A Game of Thrones, our author was well into his thoughts about A Clash of Kings. We will get back to this point later. So as I said earlier, A Game of Thrones was published at the beginning of August and Blood of the Dragon at the end of May. And due to the publishing process, logistically, there was no way for these two versions to be identical. Our author clearly submitted an earlier version of the Daenerys story to Asimov's science fiction, with later changes appearing in A Game of Thrones. And so Blood of the Dragon is essentially a snapshot of our story during the editing process, and it may be enlightening on what was going on in our author's mind. And so you may be wondering, what are the differences between Dany's A Game of Thrones story and Blood of the Dragon? Well, to start, the biggest difference is that Blood of the Dragon does not contain Dany 2, her wedding, or Dany 6, her trip to the market where she's nearly poisoned. Yes, length is an issue for publication in a magazine, but both of these chapters also connect the Daenerys story to the rest of A Game of Thrones timeline-wise, with Ned and Robert discussing Daenerys' wedding in Eddard 2, and then the poisoner being referenced at the Small Council in Eddard 8. And most of the other changes in Blood of the Dragon are also timeline related. For example, Dany and Viserys' ages are different, how long they stay at Illyrio's is different, the advancement of Dany's pregnancy is different, when the comet arrives is different. This one in particular is very interesting as the text for Blood of the Dragon makes much more sense. A comet is an omen, a million stars in the sky happens every night. Whatever the case, it's notable that most of the edits have to do with making the Daenerys story fit into the narrative of A Game of Thrones in general. And for the most part, other than the timeline stuff, the stories are remarkably similar. I would say there's really only two significant changes. First, in Blood of the Dragon, Aegon the Conqueror is not a polygamist. He only marries one sister. And second, the house with the red door is in Tyrosh, not Braavos. And so, what do we exactly mean that the house is in Tyrosh? Well, this is the text from A Game of Thrones. The garrison had been prepared to sell them to the usurper, but one night Sir Willem Darry and 4 loyal men had broken into the nursery and stolen them both, along with her wet nurse, and set sail under cover of darkness for the safety of the Braavosian coast. That was when they lived in Braavos, in the big house with the red door. Dany had her own room there, with a lemon tree outside her window. After Sir Willem had died, the servants had stolen what little money they had left, and soon they'd been put out of the big house. Dany had cried when the red door closed behind them forever. They had wandered since then, from Braavos to Myr, from Myr to Tyrosh, and on to Qohor and Volantis and Weiss, never staying long in any one place. And this is the text from Blood of the Dragon. The garrison had been prepared to sell them to the usurper, but one night Sir Willem Darry and 4 loyal men had broken into the nursery and stolen them both, along with her wet nurse, and set sail under cover of darkness for the safety of the Braavosian coast. That was when they lived in Tyrosh, in the big house with the red door. Dany had her own room there, with a lemon tree outside her window. After Sir Willem had died, the servants had stolen what little money they had left, and soon they'd been put out of the big house. Dany had cried when the red door closed behind them forever. They had wandered since then, from Tyrosh to Myr, from Myr to Braavos, and on to Qohor and Volantis and Weiss, never staying long in any one place. And so we see a swapping out of Tyrosh for not the first mention of the Braavosian coast, but for the later mentions of Braavos itself. And that is curious, as in Blood of the Dragon, Daenerys heads off to the Braavosian coast, then ends up down in Tyrosh before heading to Myr, Braavos, Qohor, Volantis, and Weiss. Her escape route from Dragonstone doesn't make much sense. Why go north to go south? And so it perhaps stands to reason that one would want the Braavosian coast to match Braavos, thus the change. Perhaps even the editor caught this. Of course, it would be slightly easier to change the language to the Tyroshi coast and end the edits there rather than doing the whole Tyrosh-Braavos swap, but whatever. But here's the thing. While going to the Braavosi coast first and then heading down to Tyrosh is curious, the later travels of Dany and Viserys are fairly logical. Tyrosh to Myr, Myr to Braavos, a trip through the Shivering Sea to get to Qohor, and then down the Rhoyne to Volantis and over to Weiss. It's a full circle with no backtracking and only one single skipping of Pentos that one could perhaps consider odd. In A Game of Thrones, though, the trip is simply a disaster. It's Braavos to Myr, also skipping over Pentos, to Tyrosh, then Qohor? I don't know how they did that trip. Did they go through Pentos and Norvos, or did they take the Shivering Sea through Braavos and Lorath? And why weren't these other cities mentioned? You cannot get to Qohor from Tyrosh without passing through another city unless you forgo pit stops to take on water and supplies. And I'm not sure why any sailor would do that. Anyway, after that, it's on to Volantis and Weiss. As I said, it doesn't make much sense. The reverse trip Weiss to Volantis to Qohor would be much more logical. But no, for some reason, it's Qohor, Volantis, Weiss. Tyrosh directly to Qohor is literally the most illogical pairing of cities on the map. Now, one could argue that George R.R. Martin didn't know the geography of the world at this point, and thus the error. Of course, this would mean that George R.R. Martin, for some reason, decided to have a map crafted later with little regard to the geography that Daenerys established. I mean, did he even need to place Braavos that far north? But we actually have evidence that George did have some basic geography down when A Game of Thrones was released. First off, Dany and Viserys travel from Pentos to Norvos to Qohor, and then off into the Dothraki Sea in Daenerys 3 A Game of Thrones. So Qohor was definitely established as a city that's inland. And Catelyn takes a Tyroshi galley to King's Landing in Catelyn 4 A Game of Thrones, so Tyrosh was definitely established as a city that was coastal. And then we hear of Tyroshi food containing pepper, and we hear of Tyroshi honey fingers. Pepper and honey are two foods associated with a southern climate. And earlier I mentioned that A Clash of Kings was well into being written by the time A Game of Thrones was published. And the reason I bring this up is because in Tyrion 9, A Clash of Kings, about halfway through the novel, we hear of Myrcella's trip to Dorne. "I do, my lord. We are to follow the coast, staying always in the sight of land, until we reach Cracklaw Point. From there we are to strike across the narrow sea to Braavos. On no account are we to sail within sight of Dragonstone." Traveling from King's Landing to Dorne by way of Braavos was scarcely the most direct of routes, but it was the safest, or so he hoped. And so here we find that Myrcella is intentionally taking an indirect route to meet up with a Braavosi naval escort, before then heading south, which means we can deduce that Braavos is in fact north of King's Landing. Now, we aren't quite sure when Tyrion 9 was written, but considering a quarter of A Clash of Kings was finished in early 1996, and considering he describes himself as nearly finished with A Clash of Kings in November of 1996, there is a pretty good chance that our author had a rough draft, or at least a rough idea of this chapter, during the manuscript process for A Game of Thrones. After all, Aegon being a polygamist only becomes a relevant plot point near the end of A Clash of Kings in Daenerys 4 and 5, with the whole "the dragon has 3 heads" prophecy. And that change was made in time for A Game of Thrones publication. And so with Tyrion 9 coming significantly earlier, it's likely our author did in fact know that Braavos was a northern city when A Game of Thrones was published. And regarding all of this, we shouldn't ignore the striking similarities between Myrcella and Blood of the Dragon Daenerys. We have two princesses trying to evade Stannis under the protection of a sworn shield, who go across the narrow sea to Braavos indirectly before heading south. It makes one wonder if the Blood of the Dragon text is not in error, if Daenerys' journey north then south was rational, much in the same way Myrcella's was. Perhaps they too were rendezvousing with a naval escort. And so, what are we saying about Blood of the Dragon and the House with the Red Door? What does the novella reveal? Well, first off, we find that the text of Blood of the Dragon actually makes more sense than that of Game of Thrones. Not to say that the House with the Red Door is actually in Tyrosh, but it certainly fits better than Braavos. After all, Tyrosh is southern, where a lemon tree could actually grow, and Dany's travels make a whole lot more sense with Braavos and Tyrosh swapped. Not to mention, later we find out that Dany actually speaks High Valyrian with a Tyroshi accent for some reason. And second, we find that the dismissals of the errors with Braavos are not really well founded. Fixing typos as an explanation doesn't really make sense, as matching Braavosian coast to Braavos is more difficult and more problematic than matching Tyrosh to Tyroshi coast. And our author likely did have his geography generally figured out when A Game of Thrones was published, at least that of Braavos, Tyrosh, and Qohor. One being northern coastal, one being southern coastal, and one being inland. But if Blood of the Dragon actually makes more sense, why did our author change Dany's story? Why switch Tyrosh to Braavos? I mean, that is the big question. Now, regarding this, earlier I brought up that our author moved the arrival of the comet. And with that move, he actually made a passage make less sense. But it was done for a good reason. Having the comet appear in Daenerys 10 with the hatching of the dragons has a more epic feel, and the comet helps parallel Dany's change with the change of others, most notably Arya. Both Arya and Daenerys lose their hair and their patriarchal protection with the coming of the comet. And so there was a trade-off. A minor scene makes less sense, but we get a huge payoff later. And so with the switching of Tyrosh to Braavos, we have to ask ourselves, what is gained? Yes, we get consistency with Braavosian coast and Braavos, but the cost is enormous. The lemon tree now grows in a northern climate, and Dany's route is all screwed up. Overall, the passage makes less sense, not more. What's even more perplexing is that the other edits in Blood of the Dragon deal with linking Dany's story to A Song of Ice and Fire in general. And so one would think that when our author was placing Dany in Braavos, he would be thinking of Arya, our character who eventually makes it to Braavos. In fact, during the manuscript process, when the Tyrosh Braavos edit was being made, our author was simultaneously writing Arya's Clash of Kings adventures, which center around her meeting Jaqen H'ghar, a faceless man of Braavos. One would think that our author would be trying to make Dany's story and Arya's story fit together, as he did with the comet. But no, it's quite the reverse. It's the Arya story that actually reveals that Braavos is cold and rainy, not a place where a lemon tree can grow. So what was our author doing? Well, while switching Tyrosh to Braavos certainly makes less sense, in a way, it's more fitting. It's a contradiction, just like Dragonstone, just like Willem Darry, just like the Midnight Flight, and everything else on the Page of Lies. What I'm saying is that our author quite deliberately made a change to Daenerys 1 to make it more sensical on the first read, that is, matching Bravosian coast to Braavos, but nonsensical in the later revealed world of Ice and Fire. And that's about all I have to say about Blood of the Dragon. You can read it for yourself. Overall, it certainly doesn't explain or excuse the contradictions with Dany's memories. If anything, it further highlights them. And next time we'll get back to the Page of Lies and get into a full discussion of the Lemon Tree. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.